Okay, welcome back after me not
I love it.
remembering to unmute my microphone. So this week we have Nicole Stephensen, a special guest from Australia. We're going to be talking about privacy programs and various other things in relation to privacy. Nicole, I know you just introduced yourself, but could you do it again due to my technical snafu?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm always happy to do a double take. Hi, everyone. Hi, Alex. I'm delighted to be here. Alex was asking earlier if I had my wine with me, and I confess I do. It's right here. I also said I'll only have one to make sure that, that we stay on topic and that I don't start to babble. It is 8 o'clock at night here. My children are just heading off to bed. This is a perfect time, I think, to riff on our favorite topic, Alex. So thank you for having me.
I think having a bit of a babble from too much wine is always a good thing when we're talking about privacy. The whole point of this show is to make it as relaxed and as easygoing as possible. So we're trying to
Mm.
avoid, legal speak and all that boring, dry stuff that often takes place in these types of shows or podcasts or whatever. So the idea is to be as human as possible in these shows. So, I mean, Nicole, you've been working in privacy for a long time, probably as long, if not longer than I have. I think we first met on Twitter maybe 10, 11 years ago, probably even longer than that.
Yeah, this is my 21st year,
Wow.
um, which makes me feel really like a bit of a privacy grandmother, which is horrible to say, but also really wonderful when you've been in the game for this long, you get to a point where you can start talking about things, knowing that you really know about them, and having the opportunity to be a good mentor, which is something I really value at this point in my career. But yeah, 21 years.
How do you explain your job when people ask you what you do?
Um, well, usually they tune out if I kind of get into it. So I say, like cybersecurity, but it's about protecting personal information and not just all the data. And that usually gets me over the line with folks who really don't work in privacy or the privacy space. When I talk about my job to privacy people, though, because our career paths are so diverse, even within this field, right?
Yeah.
I have a great time talking about what I do because I specialize in privacy program management and acculturation. So I'm not just that, in the weeds privacy compliance person. I'm not working on policies and processes and systems and integrations, maybe the way that I did in my early days. Now I talk strategy and building something that's worthwhile in terms of an organization's information practice, right? So I'm excited when I talk to privacy people about my career. And I think this kind of work is starting to percolate now into the mainstream, right?
Yeah.
Certainly with your boards and executive, they're starting to understand this language a little bit more so that their eyes don't glaze over in the first 3 seconds when I start talking about what I do and why I'm there.
Now, Australia has a really long history when it comes to privacy law. One of the earliest privacy laws in the modern world, actually. I know.
Yeah.
I know when I was working at Privacy International, obviously Simon Davies is Australian, so he started his career way back when the first laws in Australia came into effect. But the laws in Australia are quite different to the laws here in Europe, and obviously different to the laws in other parts of the world, such as the California Act in the US and the Brazilian
Mhm.
data protection law. So, what challenges do you find that you face in Australia which are different to the sorts of things that we see here in Europe and elsewhere?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin? This is, you know, so I'll first start by saying that I actually started my privacy career in Canada, which has a very beautiful and rich tradition in terms of privacy law. And they also have a similar system to what we have here in Australia, which is where you have a primary federal piece of privacy legislation, and then you have each of the states and territories, or in Canada's case, the provinces, that also have their own kind of unique privacy laws that relate to mostly it's public sector privacy. And oh, so that really helped actually when I moved over here in 2003 because I was across the kind of system that I was coming into, and also that I was working with principles based privacy legislation. So it's actually that really beautiful space in administrative law where, look, if you can apply principles in a consistent and replicable way and make good decisions following those principles, you're probably going to be okay in a profession like privacy. And that's really how my I guess my understanding of the workings of Australian privacy law occurred, it was kind of the compare and contrast with what I had experienced in Canada up until that time. But what was really interesting was when I moved over here. Of course, we had our federal privacy law, Privacy Act of 1988. So it's it's a fairly old and substantial piece of legislation that's been amended a few times along the way to keep up with changes to the world and the economy and technology. Um, but then we also had this gap with our states and territories in terms of how they were managing personal information, particularly in those public sector entities. And the state that I moved to, Queensland, actually didn't have a privacy law at all. At the time, we had something called an information standard, which was an administrative privacy regime using those administrative type privacy principles for decision making within government. And look, I actually thought it didn't work too badly because it was something, and it was unique and it was new in terms of how Queensland was doing its business in terms of governing personal information in that government context. But it was never ideal that it was an ought to do or a nice to have as opposed to something that was required of all government agencies. There's this ability to sort of risk manage out of an information standard in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do with a privacy law. So I had over time this wonderful exposure to the Queensland public sector and had the opportunity to work on the drafting of Queensland's first privacy law. And that was that was a really pivotal moment for me in my career because people from a public policy perspective, our decision makers were sitting up and taking notice of the need not just to align with what the federal government had been doing for many, many years, right? But also to pick up on this idea that the community has expectations around how their personal information is handled by government.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't self select out of that, right? It's really hard if you're not happy with what your government is doing at a state level or even a local government level. You can't just pick up and move to another state or go to another municipality so you can get the personal information handling practices that you feel you deserve. You have to live with it.
Yeah, it's
And
interesting because we see companies forum shop all the time, but it's actually very
yeah,
difficult for us as data subjects to forum shop, as you say, to move to a territory which is going to be, let's say, more friendly towards our fundamental rights as we have them
yeah,
in the EU at least. Yeah.
exactly. So that was it was wonderful to be part of that development. But and where I was going with this sort of long-winded, let me tell you about how it is in Australia, is is that it is quite a patchwork quilt here. And I call it a patchwork quilt, particularly when I'm, delivering executive briefings or training. But, I actually sort of mean that it's something else. It's like having split personalities or something in this country in terms of how privacy is regulated. It's more like a double-sided patchwork quilt because on one hand we have this sort of hodgepodge collection of privacy laws that are all mainly in step with each other in terms of the principles that we adhere to, but often a bit out of step with where the world is at, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the global data economy and all of that stuff, our privacy laws haven't really caught up, and most of the state and territory privacy laws are still struggling to keep pace with what's happening with the Australian privacy law landscape. There's lots happening there. Um, so there's that side of things, but then we have the flip side of the patchwork quilt, which is also about privacy, and that's that component about information security. And in a privacy context, we think of information security as protecting personal information through its life cycle, right? All
Yeah.
the physical and the technical and the administrative things that we do
And I know
to
exactly what you're going to say now about what the
right.
perspective is from the company, right?
Yeah, but what happens here is that we've got this information security requirement embedded within our privacy principles. We're meant to be applying this to our decision making, but then we have all these other laws in Australia that are undermining the ability for organizations to do that
Mm.
effectively. So while we believe in privacy, it's part of our culture. It's normatively very important to us. In a Western democracy, we have the flip side, which is that Australia is part of, the Five Eyes Union, and it means that we have very strong elements of a surveillance state, and we have certain pieces of legislation that, while we're doing all this wonderful work on privacy on the one hand, where law enforcement or national security interests appear to be paramount, pretty much privacy is tipped on its head in that particular instance, and the information security legislation, or there's a few ones, but we just sort of call it our surveillance legislation, sort of trumps everything else, and that's something that doesn't sit well, I don't think, with most privacy professionals here. I won't speak for all of my colleagues by any means, but it is certainly I guess, a dichotomy that we struggle to operate within and still provide, that really good and meaningful and timely advice about information practice.
No, I agree. I mean, you've lived in two Five Eyes countries. I've lived in two Five Eyes countries, the UK and
Yeah.
the US, you, Canada, and Australia. And we see this conflict all the time, all the time. Whenever the government want to try and push through a new surveillance law or strengthen their surveillance capabilities, it's the same old stories. We have to think about the children. We have to think about the terrorists. These knee-jerk reactions, which are often completely contradictory to fundamental rights, the right to privacy and the right to data protection. It's problematic. And when we look at countries like China and Russia, and we're usually highly critical of them, but if you look at PIPL, which is the Chinese law, which was introduced in November last year, or came into force in November last year, it's very, very similar to GDPR when it comes to how
Yes.
companies process data. But the government in China obviously have a lot, let's just say, a much stronger focus on surveillance and control of the population. So when it comes to privacy and data protection at the government level, it's very different. And it's not really that far from where we are in Five Eyes countries, in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. We see this constant conflict and contradiction between what we expect companies to do with our personal data and how to respect our
Yes.
privacy. But when it comes to the governments, their attitude is the complete polar opposite, right?
Yeah. And it's a really interesting point you make, because if you look at, so one of the big pieces of legislation that causes privacy advocates in Australia consternation, it's called, and this is a mouthful, I've written it down just so that I don't mess it up, the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment Assistance and Access Act of 2018. So it's a mouthful. We call it the Assistance and Access
Mm-hmm.
Act, or some folks call it TOLA, right? So there are a couple of different ways that we shorten or abbreviate its title. But the whole point of it is that the law was intended to sort of amend your telecommunications laws or computer access warrants and search warrants, amend that space to allow for greater access for law enforcement to data. And in particular, they wanted access to the data that has been encrypted. And what we have are some companies, and I think it's really interesting because we're applying to companies, I, I think perhaps a test or a bar that doesn't actually necessarily sit well with the community that the government serves or is meant to be serving in creating this legislation. And these companies, right? They're actually, they're called, sometimes here I've heard them referred to as the FANG companies. So
Okay.
FANG companies. So the F stands for Facebook, which is now Meta,
Yeah.
right? So it won't work. You can't really call it the Mang companies. It doesn't sound as good, right? But so it stands for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google.
Well, that's much better
And
than
this,
GAFAM, which we have in the EU, is the anagram, which I don't like. I think FANG is much better because it seems more sinister, right?
yeah, well, it does. But it also, if you think about who those companies are, these are our data companies, our data brokers, right? These are our big, big data. They're the guys who are collecting and using and selling and manipulating all that data about all of us. And they have a particular business model, right?
Yeah.
Their business model is predicated on data, and like whether I like it or not, like, it's a big part of the economy,
Surveillance
right? It's a big
capitalism.
part
Yeah.
of the economy. And this particular piece of surveillance legislation really could upend those types of companies by asking them to put measures in place that they wouldn't otherwise put in place, like creating tools to decrypt the data that they have taken pains to forever encrypt. And the reason they took pains to do that was to make good on their privacy promises, right? So there's this weird tautology that we have now. On one hand, we're asking all of these folks to do the right thing by the community that they're seeking data from for their own purposes. And then on the other hand, we're saying, yeah, but only sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that kind of circular logic does my head in. And um, so I can see both sides of the equation here, where the companies that are opposed to this type of legislation and why. But equally, privacy advocates being opposed to this type of legislation because it it really undermines what cryptography is intended to do for us. And you think about, wow, that technology actually is a positive technology when used well and used consistent with its original aim. Um, and yet here we are. We're in this place where seems like there's 95 sides to the debate, and all I can think is, wow, if I was the baddie, really, if I was the baddie that these laws are sort of intended to disrupt or interfere with, I would not. I would do everything to get my hands on that tool, whatever
Mm.
that tool is that Apple has to come up with in order to satisfy that law in Australia, or Netflix, or whomever else. Even some of the smaller companies would certainly be prey in that circumstance.
That's really interesting because the US have a law called CALIA, which is Communications Assistant for Law Enforcement Act, which
Mm-hmm.
is similar but not the same. So under CALIA, they can't a company can't be forced to re-engineer their products to provide access. But any new
Right.
products which come into the market, particularly anything which is telecommunications, as part of the core product, are required to have certain things in. So, for example, in 2005, Skype were forced by the FBI to add a back door from Skype to POTS. POTS is playing a telephone system. So back in the day, you used to be able to call, and you still can probably, used to be able to call from Skype somebody on a regular phone line. And because the FBI had capability for wiretap on regular phone calls, they argued that because they're crossing from voice over IP to
Mm.
POTS, that they should have this same level of access. So Skype in 2005 were actually forced to add this back door for calls from Skype to regular telephone numbers. The other way around, obviously, they already had that capability because you were calling from a phone into Skype, so
Yeah.
it wasn't such an issue. In the UK, we have Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which I was very successful in forcing the government to change through infringement proceedings in the European Commission because they implemented confidentiality of communications clauses from the e-privacy directive incorrectly into UK law. So they were forced to change that. But essentially, it's a similar thing. If you have data which is encrypted, and the police request the keys for that encryption,
Mm.
you're required to hand them over. And if you don't, it's a strict liability offence. So there's no defence against it, and the consequences of that are up to 5 years in prison. So we have these laws in the US, in the UK, obviously in Australia. We're seeing more and more of this coming through in Europe now. So it's a very topical time to be talking about this because we have chat control. I don't know if you're familiar with chat control. So
No.
chat control was a derogation to the e-privacy directive, to the confidentiality of
Mm-hmm.
communications, which was proposed by the European Commission in what year are we in now? We're in 2022. In 2020, I
Mm-hmm.
campaigned very heavily against it and was at a number of sessions of the European Parliament, sponsored by Patrick Breyer, the MEP from Germany. And essentially, this was a measure which was adopted as a derogation by the European Commission to confidentiality communications for the purpose of detecting child sexual abuse images. So they call it CSAM, or child sexual abuse media,
Yes.
in messages from individuals over voice messaging systems or instant messaging systems like WhatsApp and Signal, or even DMs on Twitter, or your private message on Facebook and forums, etc., etc. And this was introduced as a voluntary measure, so companies had the option to implement this. And the whole point was they're supposed to scan every single message, which we're talking many billions of messages a day across the EU. Bear in mind, there's 500 million people here, and then detect whether or not, based on a database in the US of hash files, whether or not a specific type of media is child pornography. And whereas as a survivor of abuse myself, and this is where I came into the discussion, I'm a privacy advocate, but I'm also a survivor of physical and sexual abuse in my childhood. So it's an issue which is very close to my heart. And when you look at this from the perspective of the survivors of abuse, it's really important that we have confidentiality communications, because we don't trust people generally. And if we remove these channels where you can be guaranteed confidentiality, so by reducing encryption in order to be able to scan these messages for this type of content, you're making it much more difficult for survivors to obtain the support they need, because you don't ever get over abuse, right? It's with you for your entire life. And B, to be able to report your crimes, in a way which is confidential and is going to be protective of you. So by removing the right to privacy, by removing the confidentiality communications, you're actually having a dramatic impact on the people that you claim you're trying to protect, in this case, abuse victims. And when we looked at the technology as well, it was really ineffectual. It wasn't fit for purpose. It was a massive false positive rate. And in the whole period of time that this had been tested, there was something that Patrick Bray's research from the European Parliament showed, I think 65 cases to date out of billions of messages being surveilled. And of those 65 cases, only a handful were actually prosecuted on the basis of chat control. The rest were all reported by individuals, personally reported by individuals. So it's completely ineffective. It's not proportionate. It doesn't meet the proportionality and necessity requirements of EU law. And it was voluntary, but on May 11th, I believe, this year, the European Commission are looking to implement a new proposal which would make this mandatory. And with that mandatory proposal comes this attack on encryption, providing encryption backdoors. Because as you know, our iMessage, Signal, etc., they're all encrypted end to end. So in order for these platforms to be able to detect that information, they need to be able to decrypt the messages, or to look at the information before it's encrypted and sent to the intended recipient. So we're in a very, very strange time currently. We had a judge from the European Court, a retired judge from the European Court of Justice, do an investigation on chat control, the previous edition, version 1. And she said, as we said, that this does not comply with EU law, does not comply with EU case law, doesn't meet the proportionality and necessity requirements, which are the bedrock of European law under TFEU. So it's a very, very difficult time. And again, it's this knee-jerk reaction. There's not been any thought go into it. And it's very difficult to get politicians to stand up against this, because they don't want to be seen as being, protecting child predators. They don't want to be seen as preventing children from being subjected to this type of really harmful activity. And there's no question it's incredibly harmful and needs to be stopped. But the method that we're using isn't going to stop it, because, of course, what happens, the people who are committing these crimes, they go underground. They start using open source technologies, or they start using technologies which they can develop themselves of encryption. So things like steganography, which makes it much more difficult to trace, etc. So, just as you have in Australia, this new law, which is anti-encryption, and we're seeing a lot of rhetoric from the FBI in the US trying to introduce similar laws in the US. Now we've got the EU doing the same thing with chat control version 2, which will be challenged in the European Court. But it's going to take several years to get there, and during that time, billions or hundreds of billions of communications will be intercepted and scanned.
I'd be really interested to see any sort of because this is a really such a topical issue. I'd be really interested to see, the harms assessments, or, you know, the legislation development version of privacy impact assessments. And most legislative development processes need to go through something like that, whether they call it different things, right, depending on where you are in the world. But if there were a harms assessment associated with this legislative development process, you know, where the I guess where the decision makers would land. I agree with you about proportionality. It'd be because I am not so far across this issue that I can really have an opinion on it. I would love to be able to inform my opinion more by seeing something like a harms assessment, and understand, where there is potential harm to victims and survivors, for example, of child sexual abuse on the one hand. What is the, in terms of proportionality, what's the benefit? Does the benefit actually outweigh that harm in this instance? And it sounds to me like there hasn't been that level of analysis done, or if it has been done, it hasn't necessarily been taken into consideration within the process.
Yeah, I mean, it has been done in the case of chat control, and it was shown to be completely ineffective in the grand scheme of things. 60 cases, of which only a handful were down to chat control,
Yeah.
out of literally surveillance of billions of messages. So clearly, it's ineffective from that perspective. And I think the amount of money which is being spent on these as well. I would rather see that money funneled into doing research on why people abuse in the first place and trying to prevent that, so trying to deal with the root cause of the problem rather than
Mm.
trying to put a band-aid over the consequences, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, such a good point. And this comes back to the work we do every day, which is the solution doesn't always have to be a tech solution. You don't always have to change a law or implement a technology or build a new thing. Sometimes you have to change your way of thinking or looking at a problem,
Yeah, I mean, it
you
always
know?
reminds me when I was doing my psychology degree, my professor said, because I was writing my dissertation on reoffending rates of child sexual abusers and violent criminals, and I got quite depressed because obviously it was a very personal issue for me, and I was struggling, and my professor sat down with me in a seminar one day, one-on-one seminar, and he said to me, he said, look, if you see a child drowning in the river, what do you do? I said, well, obviously,
Yeah.
I jump in, I try and save the child. He says, okay, so you've saved that child, you get back on the shore and you see another child floating down the river. What do you do? So I jump in. He says, okay, so the children keep coming. What do you do? I said, well, I try and save more. He says, but you can't. You're going to become overwhelmed. You're going to become tired. You're not going to be physically capable of rescuing all these children. Well,
Yeah.
do you not think it would be much better to go upstream and find out why the children are landing in the river in the first place? Attack the cause instead of the consequences. And that was a
Yeah.
light bulb moment for me that made me realize at that point, no, this is exactly right. We can't just
Mm-hmm.
keep dealing with the consequences of social issues. We have to deal with the
Mm-hmm.
cause of these. And that means investing in research and trying to establish why people do this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in my research, one of the things I discovered was normalization was a big factor in reoffending rates. So the people in prison who are guilty and have been prosecuted of crimes against children argue that the advertising industry sexualized children at a young age, the fashion industry sexualizes people at a young age, the
Mm-hmm.
entertainment industry. If you look at Bill Wyman dating Mandy Smith at 14 years old, from the
Mm-hmm.
Rolling Stones, and so all of this is normalized in advertising, in entertainment, and various other areas of our society, and then we wonder why some people then go on and abuse vulnerable individuals and children. If we don't change the way that we're presenting these individuals or these demographics in society, then we can only expect there to be negative consequences as a result of that. That doesn't justify it, but it does explain at least one reason why these offenders are doing what they do. And if we investigated that and tried to establish how we could fix that, then maybe the problem would be mitigated to a certain extent.
Well, I'm really interested in following your work on this too, and just seeing where you land in this debate, because it's obviously still ongoing and it's an important one. Yes, in privacy, right? So there's that sort of that relationship to the work that we do, that we both do, but it's also an important one broadly, right? In terms of you know, just the mental and physical well-being of our world population on this particular topic, and ensuring that it gets the airtime that it deserves. And I'm really interested in following what happens there, and I thank you for bringing it to my attention. I, particularly because I follow these issues more in probably the more microcosm that I work within, in terms of online, say, cybersecurity and cyber safety for kids. I do quite a bit of work in that space, and of course, I follow what our e-safety commissioner here, Julian Mingrant, is doing, and it's it all is quite connected. You know, the world is a small place, and what trickles out of the EU in terms of public policy, it doesn't take long for it to land in other parts of the world, as you've
Yeah, yeah.
rightly mentioned,
It does
in
set
terms
the
of the
benchmark.
yeah. And so we don't just see that, right? In say with GDPR's kind of prominence worldwide at the moment, we're seeing this in this space now as well with these, you know, folks might think that they're micro changes, but they can actually have a really astounding ripple effect. And this is why I mentioned harms analysis, because I actually think a lot of the things we do in terms of legislative development, project development, um, community and social development, whatever the things are that we're doing, we often think we have a really good idea, but we
Mm.
don't often protest it against, known or perceived harms that may flow out of a particular decision. And that's a space I tend to work in a lot in privacy, in particular in privacy. But I can see that being, absolutely 100% relevant in this more micro space that you and I are talking about now.
Yeah. We have quite a few people in the chat, so I'm just going to see if anybody
Oh,
has any
lovely.
questions. So we have Rick 1980. Rick, you've given us a lot of personal details in your username there. You should perhaps change that. So Rick says maybe increase the age of consent. I don't really think that's going to work because reality is children are becoming grown up much quicker nowadays. So increasing the age of consent is the opposite to what kids want, right? They want the age of consent to be reduced. And age of consent is variable, very variable across the world. And even, consent in some parts of the world would be completely invalid than it is in other parts of the world. So, for example, I was, just Rick astounded days. I'm going to allow that because we're a growing channel. There we go. So, yeah, so in some places, for example, when you look at cultural difference, so if you think about if a man was to have a child commit an act of fellatio on him in the West, then that would be considered as child sexual abuse. But if you go to certain tribes in the Amazon, a young boy committing fellatio on a tribal elder would be considered as an act of a rite of passage. It's part of the rite of passage from becoming a boy to becoming a man, which to us in Western society seems bizarre. How can we subject children to this type of thing? But this is a cultural thing which goes back thousands and thousands of years. We can't ignore that. So context is really important as well. So for example, in certain countries we have age of consent at 12, 13, 14 years old. In other countries that age of consent is 18 years old. So it becomes very difficult to determine where does that balance lie. Even in GDPR, one of the derogations for processing information about children when it comes to consent was that age of consent. At what point can we consider that a child is eligible to give consent? It sounds like a very interesting dog you got back there. And we
Well,
have
we have a healthy kangaroo population here, and I think she's just noticed one outside. So I apologize to everyone.
we have the same
It's a,
thing with deer and moose here. We have a lot of them. So yeah.
yeah. But I want to comment there that I think sometimes, again, where we jump to solutions like, um, in privacy or in any other discussion, right? So, the discussion of child sexual abuse is one that I think we have to be really careful and really considered about in our public policy making. That is my deepest, longest held view, because there are, young people, and also victim survivors who are at stake in this. So that's one comment that I want to make. The other is, like, if we go back just generally to privacy, to good decision making, to public policy making, the problem with the way that our privacy laws are being constructed worldwide, being rolled out and applied worldwide, and even in the way that they're being reviewed worldwide, is that we often have that knee jerk reaction instead of taking our time to really look at an issue, with all its component parts, and take a really long, holistic look at the issue, almost from a place of, um, the public interest. Or if you've ever sort of focused on things like, public interest technologies or that sort of field of study, it's about a holistic assessment of issues, whenever it is you're going to build things, taking the community, social constructs, and a variety of other things into account before making a decision. So when you say something like, well, just change the age of consent, what that does is it potentially introduces a whole host of other problems that while you might solve one, you may be introducing a whole host of other problems across a whole host of other areas that you really need to delve down into before making that decision.
Mm.
And I this is something that I have to say from like a an organizational privacy context. So, I was talking earlier how I work in that space of privacy program management and acculturation. It's really, really funny when you're working with say an immature privacy culture in an organization. There is that greater
I've never come
tendency.
across that.
No,
No,
it's
never,
fun.
never.
Well, I've never come across a super mature one either. But what you get is that oh well, here's a solution, and it looks good, and it puts a band-aid on the problem, and it allows us to carry on and continue our work and continue to make money, but it doesn't actually deal with the symptoms. So going back to your analogy of the sort of plucking the kids out of the river downstream, what you need to do is stop them from jumping into the river upstream.
Yeah, or being
And
pushed in the river.
this this is yes, and this is true in our day-to-day work in privacy program management and culture building. This is what we have to focus on.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So you mentioned earlier that you helped draft the Queensland law.
Hmm.
I've been in a similar situation. I helped draft the e-privacy regulation with the European Parliament. Both of us are non-lawyers, right? So how
Hmm.
did you find the reaction from lawyers in your professional network, or at the events or the consultations where you turned up? Did you find any pushback from them?
Okay, so the really interesting thing is everyone has always thought I am a lawyer, and I just, I never have said that I'm a lawyer. I always put myself out as a public policy professional, because that is what I am. So I studied public policy. I studied, through that course of study, administrative decision making and all the things that you need to know to move into a field like privacy, or some of the things you need to know. Certainly the things I needed to know back, in the late 1990s. Moving into privacy then was a lot different than
Yeah,
it would be
yeah,
moving into privacy now. Um, what's really interesting though is that the when folks have said, "Oh, I thought you were a lawyer. I'm really surprised." The next comment out of their mouths tends to be that my approach is really refreshing because it's not compliance driven. And I think that's great because that's kind of the point. I think we need lawyers in privacy. We need excellent lawyers in privacy to be able to unpack all of this crazy spaghetti, right, that we have worldwide in terms of not just privacy laws, but all the other laws and standards that impact information practice, right, wherever we are. We need some fine lawyers. But what we need are also people like you and me who can make all of that stuff digestible to the organizations that we are then serving and advising.
yeah.
And that's where I come in.
And
So,
we definitely need more people like us writing the laws as well, or at least being engaged and involved
yeah.
in that drafting process. Because as you know from your experience in industry, whenever we go into a client, there's always this chasm. It's not even a gap; it's a chasm between
Mm-hmm.
legal, marketing, tech, engineering, etc.
Mm-hmm.
None of these individual groups or professional groups mingle well together. None of them understand each other's language. They don't understand each other's principles or anything, any of the direction that they're coming from. And the same is
Mm.
true when it comes to drafting laws. If you've only got lawyers and politicians drafting laws, then you're going to get a very poor law as a result because it's not going to take into consideration any of the things which matter to any other stakeholders. So it's really important that you have people who are non-lawyers and non-politicians engaged in that drafting process to make sure that all voices are heard and you have a round law that meets many people's expectations and requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the public policy analysis is robust. And I think that oftentimes if you're tasked with drafting something, and it needs to look like a few other things that have been drafted. It's pretty easy to kind of, you know, to do that. You find your clauses, you sort of do your copy and paste, and you change a few things. And look, that's fine if you're developing something that doesn't impact individuals every day. If you're developing something that, I don't know, might have to do with financial policy or what
Yeah.
have you. But when we're talking about information practice, in particular, you know, the way that personal information is managed through its life cycle, and asking government officers to make good decisions based on whatever it is you're drafting. What sits in behind that has to be some really strong analysis to talk about why we're doing this from a public policy perspective, who it is that we're serving, what are the tensions that we're trying to relieve by drafting the law in this manner, whether we have any exceptions to the rules that can be applied, and when might we apply those kinds of exceptions, talking about leeway and providing a degree of explanation about how that leeway ought to be used.
Mm.
That's the role that folks like you and I have and can be really good at in this space. And it's certainly something that I encourage folks who are interested in getting into privacy, who who want to really be at the coalface of change. Get yourself into a policy shop,
Mm.
in an attorney general's department or department of prime minister and cabinet, or wherever they're making the laws that are of substance to you, and get yourself in there and be part of a drafting team.
I know in my experience, the first 3 to 5 years working in privacy, the first 3 years I was working in privacy, I was working at Privacy International, and spent a lot of time in Brussels. And up until this
Mm-hmm.
date, I've spent a lot of time in Brussels lobbying. I'm a registered lobbyist in Brussels. And for the first 3 to 5 years, I found that not all, in fact, I have a lot of legal friends, but many of the lawyers, particularly those who are lobbying on behalf of the companies I'm lobbying against,
Hmm.
they just didn't accept me. They felt that I had absolutely no right to be in Brussels. I had no right to be involved in policy discussion because I didn't have a legal background, despite the fact that the things I'd done had committed more change to EU policy and law than any of these lawyers had ever done in their careers without a legal background. So I found it very difficult and really annoying. Now it's the opposite. Now I have most of the people that come to me for advice are lawyers, which is really
Yeah.
strange. And I've taught many, many hundreds of lawyers on privacy compliance and for
Mm.
their professional certifications. So now it's completely different. But back then, in the mid 2000s, 2008, I started in privacy full time. Back then, it was very difficult if you weren't a lawyer, particularly in Europe, to be accepted in the space as being a relevant voice and one that had a right to be there.
Well, I'm glad that that's changed for you, and I'm glad that that's not. It hasn't really been my direct experience. My direct experience has never been, you ought to be a lawyer, or you should be a lawyer, or you can't compete in this industry if you're not a lawyer. That hasn't been my experience. But also, I've been operating in jurisdictions that are different,
Mm.
and um, the certainly with the advent of GDPR and the complexities of GDPR, this is a space where lawyers would be finding themselves, comfortably ensconced, and quite rightly so. But there's a matter of education there that folks like you and like me and others that are in our industry, we bring that to the table in a really meaningful way. Um, Also, being able to talk to executives, to be able to talk to the C suite about why we have a law like this, why we need to move toward compliance with a law like this. What are the various different strategies that we can deploy in order to do that? How do we get there safely? These are discussions that are well held by policy professionals, right? By risk
Yeah, yeah,
professionals.
yeah. What is the
Yes.
demand like in Australia? Because I know I've noticed over the past 18 months in the EU that a lot of the work now coming into the compliance space, particularly around GDPR and e-privacy, is now requiring a legal qualification in order to even apply for the role. I would say 90% plus of the jobs that
Mhm.
I see nowadays are requiring legal qualification, which is why I'm currently doing my LLM, just so I can get that qualification so I can then
Mm,
apply for these roles, which is ridiculous under the circumstances. But, these are the hoops we have to jump through. Are you seeing a
yeah.
similar trend in Australia?
Do you know in some roles, yes. So for some of your big corporates, particularly those who are hiring for their privacy teams, so they may have a chief privacy officer and then sort of a suite of support persons who work with them. Those supporting roles are typically counsel roles, and and you see them advertised as such, which is kind of a shame because you know I don't think necessarily those roles require being a lawyer, particularly in Australia, where we have our laws are principle based.
Same, same in Europe, yeah.
We're not in a position here where you need to be able to understand and apply the law. Absolutely. But necessarily being a lawyer to do that actually just cuts out a whole bunch of really amazing professionals who could be working in that space, who may have a great deal more corporate knowledge um, than the lawyer that they end up hiring, but just by virtue of not being one, they're left out. I think that's a shame. I think that might actually be a discussion that chief privacy officers or even executive who are supporting these roles need to have with human resources and or the recruiters that they're talking with about getting these roles together and out to market. It's that maybe a legal qualification is highly desirable, and that's because folks with legal qualifications often can work in this space and unpack incredibly complex things and have tremendous critical analysis skills, right? Great writing skills, all of those things. But to say on a position description that legal qualification is highly desirable but not mandatory, that may help others get in the door.
Hmm.
Because I can tell you some of the best privacy people I know do not have law degrees,
Same.
but they come from public policy backgrounds, risk management backgrounds. Many of them come from information and cybersecurity backgrounds. Some are former professors. Even there's one actually really wonderful up and coming privacy professional that I know who I mentored for a couple of years. She started in privacy as she sort of slid in from a role in nursing,
Who is she? Let's give her some credit
and
on a.
her name is Lee. Her name is Lee Clogan. Now, the thing I have to say about Lee, though, is she does have a law degree. But at the time, she didn't. She decided to go and get a law degree because she was interested in privacy law. And so while she was working as a registered nurse, she moved forward into studying privacy law. Well, she's now working as a privacy officer at Flight Center Travel Group, and I think that is an amazing place for her to be. What a rich environment to work in terms of all the craziness around data and data projects and customer service, and a multinational company with these combined privacy and information security needs. I think it would be a wonderful place for somebody with such amazing sort of cross section of skills to work. So, um, but it's funny because yes, she does have a law degree, but I that would not have been required for her to get that job.
You just touched
Um,
on one of the things, probably the most enjoyable thing about my job, actually, which is mentoring and training, changing culture,
mm,
changing minds, making people understand why these things are important as opposed to it just being a job. So that's one of
mm,
my favorite things. You mentioned you do a lot of training, and a lot of your work is about changing cultures and organization. Would you say that's
mhm.
the thing that you like most about your job, or is there something else that you like most?
No, I like it. I like it the most because so when you walk into a room full of folks who see privacy as a roadblock or a drag on progress, and you leave 15 minutes or an hour later having watched the penny drop for each and every one of those
See those
people in the
light
room,
bulbs turn on.
it is
Yeah.
it is incredible. incredibly gratifying, and that's why I do this work.
Yeah, I mean, I give a lot of public speaking engagements, and some of those are under Singularity University, where I speak to C-suite people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I got involved in Singularity University was to be able to have that influence at the core level with all these companies coming out of Silicon Valley and the big energy and pharmaceutical companies and banking companies, etc. And you get these people in a room, and they're in there, they're all fun and happy, and to them it's a couple of days off work, and they end up doing something fun. And then by the end of the session, you see these light bulbs go on, and then the questions come in, and they're really interesting. You can see that people are genuinely thinking about these issues. I always try and make people take off their work hat and imagine how they would feel if they were engaged in this type of activity, and it was for their 8-year-old daughter or their 85-year-old grandmother. How then would they
Mm-hmm.
feel about these types of data processing activities, and would they still feel okay about it? And when you can displace people from that work environment and put them into a human environment, and turn
Mm-hmm.
this into a human conversation, their attitudes change, and they very quickly start to understand where these issues arise. And when you can do that and you see that, it's immensely satisfying as a privacy professional to be able to
It
facilitate
really
that.
is. And particularly when it happens at the C suite,
Yeah,
because I actually think that that's where, while you can have grassroots change, and don't get me wrong, I've seen some amazing um, managers and project officers and, amazing folks on the ground um, with a grassroots approach to privacy and a really strong care factor. Unless you have the leadership at the top also singing the same song and sharing the same messages and being consistent with that and accountable with that, you will always have a gap in privacy practice in your
yeah,
organization.
yeah. You need that
So
support.
yeah, you do. And so when you have a CEO that is happy to champion privacy in an organization, I really feel that they're putting their money where their mouth is at that point, and they're committing.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that, yeah, it's incredibly gratifying when that happens.
whenever I'm interviewing for a role as a consultant, or even if I'm considering full time employment, which is not as often as consulting, um, I always, people say you're always being asked questions by the interviewers about, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what you like, what you don't like, etc. And then you get to the point where they ask if you have any questions. And so often I find people are nervous and they don't ask the questions. I always ask, what do you like most about your job? What do you hate most about your job? What's the buy-in from senior management and the C-suite like? What's how much support do you have from the
Mm-hmm.
board? What is the reason for the company taking the approach that they're taking? Why are they implementing a privacy program? And if the answers come back and they're not the right answers, then I simply will not accept the role. I turn away more jobs than I take on, because it's just not the right fit for me. There's no genuine
Yeah.
commitment from the organization.
See, and I sort of see that as like, that's a clarion call for me. When I get the wrong answer, I think, okay, how
Challenge
am I going to,
accepted.
yes, how am I going to change hearts and minds? Um, one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I think it really it relates to this, is that if organizations aren't budgeting for privacy, if they're not budgeting for privacy, it's not going to happen.
Hmm.
So you know how right now we're having all this discussion all around the world, and it's largely thanks to GDPR, I think, for elevating the concept of privacy by design. And I remember when Dr. Ankavukian coined the term and introduced those principles to the world, and thinking, oh wow, this is awesome. I can't wait to share this, share this with everybody and start, building a world where this is at its core. GDPR really helped to elevate it in terms of profile, right?
Yeah.
And to bring that whole notion into the mainstream. But where organizations are talking privacy by design in their privacy policies and in, whatever their communications, whatever their comms are out to the general public, if they're not really recognizing that privacy by design is about privacy at the outset, baking it in, then they're going to get nowhere. And the way that I can always tell whether they really have a PBD ethos or not is if they budgeted for privacy.
Yeah.
So if they don't have a privacy team or a dedicated privacy person. And if they don't have money available for their project teams to do privacy impact assessments, then they don't have a PBD ethos at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So I definitely think the budget is a big one.
I think also organizations need to understand what PVD is. I did 6 months
Yeah.
in a huge global company, one of the biggest companies in their sector in the world, and was hired to work on privacy by design. They weren't doing
Mm-hmm.
privacy by design. They were adhering to maybe one or two of the principles of privacy by design, but not
Mm-hmm.
all of the principles of privacy by design. And I explained to them time and time again, look, this isn't privacy by design. You can't do privacy by design by ignoring the majority of the principles of privacy by design. They are privacy by design. If you miss even one of them, you're not doing privacy by design.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a big issue. But there's been some recent developments in this space. Have you looked at FIDES yet?
No, tell me.
So FIDES is a privacy by design framework which gets embedded at the code level. So this is something for privacy engineering. It's never
Oh,
existed before.
super.
It's done by a company in the US called Ethica. I'm hopefully going to
Mm-hmm.
be, well, I'll be interviewing their CEO on another show in the near future to talk all about it
Mm-hmm.
because I'm going to be doing a series on privacy enhancing technologies and privacy engineering. And it
Mm-hmm.
literally allows you to create policies which get embedded in code. And then when the code is tested and going through its, this cycle of testing and development, you can
Mm.
measure whether or not those privacy controls have been implemented, and you can report based on that. You can make block code from being deployed based on certain measures not being met. So it's really the first time in all the time I've been
Mm.
working in privacy, and even in all the time I've been working in technology for 30 years as a computer scientist, I've never
Yes.
seen a framework like this. And this is critical because if the engineers, and in my experience, engineers really do not understand privacy or privacy by design, if we can give them the tools which they can embed within their development stack throughout that software development lifecycle, then we will start to see changes. We will start to see real
Mhm.
meaningful changes at the code level.
This is so good. And this is really, it's exciting to think that there may be a metric now for privacy in systems, or like a real metric.
Yeah,
Because the metric that we tend to work with in privacy program management, as you know, when you're sort of looking at levels of maturity, it's, are there controls?
yeah,
And, are controls being developed? When were they developed? When were they deployed? Uh, are we testing their uses? Those sorts of things. But it's not about baking the controls in. So this is a different kind of metric,
yeah,
and that's really exciting. And and it's actually probably going to be the place where privacy gets some teeth for a change, because usually it's when it's to do with systems, that's where it will fall down. And often our CEOs are being asked to risk manage privacy because they have a system or a technical solution that they've spent squillions on, and it needs to go ahead, it needs to be deployed, and but they don't have that inbuilt baked in privacy control. They have more of those sort the administrative layer or that information security oversight layer as opposed to the internals.
yeah,
I think that's fantastic.
yeah. One of my biggest bugbears about privacy programs particularly within global organizations, is this reliance on cybersecurity oversight. Privacy and
Mm,
cybersecurity are two very different things. Okay, if you're going to evaluate privacy and your privacy program based on the principles of cybersecurity, you're going to fail immediately,
yes.
because cybersecurity is looking at the risk to the organization. Privacy is looking at the risk to individuals. If you don't align those two, then you've got a problem. If you suddenly start looking at privacy from the risk of the organization, then your focus is in completely the wrong place and you're going to fail as a result. So it's really problematic from that perspective. I see this so often, not just in corporate clients, but even in education. In
Yeah.
education, we're seeing where we are seeing privacy and data protection included within the curriculum, which is rare. But when we do, it generally comes either under legal or it comes under cybersecurity. And my
Yeah.
argument, it isn't suitable in either of those categories. It needs to be
Yeah.
independent.
Yeah, I agree. And particularly where, because our organizations haven't often budgeted for privacy or strategized for privacy to the extent where it actually is its own thing, I think this is part of the problem, right? So it just gets, shoved under, I see it under corporate services all the time.
Yeah.
So sort of human resource, risk management, governance, kind of in that space. But the reality is that it is not going to be done. It's not going to be done well if you've got the wrong people thinking about it. So one of the things I hear often, and it's a classic, and you will get it too, and it's particularly around tech deployment. So I tend to work a lot lately in that smart cities and IoT or industrial
Mm-hmm.
IoT space. And so, I'm in the room and I'm listening to these wonderful explanations from vendors about what's going to be deployed, and there's usually great partnerships involved, and at some point I quietly say, well, what about privacy? And I always have someone say, oh, no, 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 it's okay, we've got security covered.
Yeah.
And I blink twice, and then I have to launch into the discussion about how privacy is different from security. It's certainly there are shared and complementary objectives, but it's a different stream of work and a different set of considerations, that you need to a different lens, I suppose, that you need to view your
Mm.
project or technology through.
Yeah. Are you good for a while yet? Because I'm enjoying the conversation and don't want to stop. But if we are
Yeah,
going to carry on,
yeah.
I'll just tell my wife
I can
who
probably do
is
another
moderating.
15 if you've got that.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
we're going to go for an extra 15 minutes. This is to my wife who's moderating the chat, so I don't get told off. So we're going to go for another 15 minutes. So let's ask a couple of questions. So what would you say, from your perspective, is the most emerging threat to privacy within organizations? Tough
You
one.
know what? Well, you know what it is? It kind of comes back to that buy-in that I was talking about at the leadership level or the strategic level. I I think in our organizations, the biggest threat actually comes from how we structure privacy to begin with. So we have often no budget for privacy, no strategy to speak of for privacy. And instead, what we have is this attention to policies and procedures and processes. And what happens then is to all the people who are working in that organization, they see privacy as a compliance burden,
Mm.
and they see it as um, a roadblock to what it is they want to do. I think that's actually where the threat exists. I think it's in the narrative, and it's in the lack of strategic imperative that's associated with privacy. So for me, the thing that I do the most of in these various different streams that I'm working in is work with organizations to build them a strategy, work with them to create something that's strong and durable so that they can make good decisions around personal information. I use for them an analogy of a tree. So often when we talk about strategy, we look at it as sort of an umbrella thing.
Yeah. I was actually
You
going to
know,
mention a tree metaphor to you. I'll do it after this.
yeah. And I use that because I say, well, if you got a good strategy, really strong foundations for privacy, so you understand what it means to you as an organization and as people within the organization, maybe you have a suite of principles that you apply to privacy. And I'm not talking privacy principles, right? I'm talking principles that subscribe to as an organization around privacy, your care factor principles.
Yeah.
And then you might have, I know it's cheesy, but it's good to have a mission and a vision or a few visions, and get that down in writing so that everything else you do in the organization when it comes to privacy ties back to something. And when you have that as, say, the roots of your tree, then you have an opportunity for that tree to grow and flourish, and one limb will be a privacy framework and another limb will be a privacy management plan, and then the branches might be your policies and your procedures and your processes. But you can see a privacy program growing quite neatly if it's got something to hang off of. Otherwise it's just a bunch of useless policies and processes that go nowhere, and mean very little.
So I think another important analogy here is, and again is using the tree, is it's said that the tree's roots mirror the tree's branches. So what you see above the ground is mirrored below ground in the roots. So if you don't have strong support at the top in the C-suite, in the board,
Mhm.
then you're not going to have the depth in the roots to be able to nourish and sustain that company
Mhm.
over the extended, the long term future. So the
Mhm.
privacy this again, the privacy program is so important that it root to branch, that every single branch is strong, that they have strong policies going all the way up the ladder in order for
Mhm.
those roots to be able to thrive and grow and spread out and support the entire infrastructure and build that foundation. So yeah,
I'm
no,
totally going to rip that off in my next executive briefing. I'm going to talk about the roots mirroring the branch structure above.
oh,
I'm
you're
going to do
very
that.
welcome. You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Also, Privacy by Design. Anne is a good friend of mine, a long-time friend of mine, and probably yours as well. I'm hoping to have her on the show in the near future. But she's done a lot of work on smart cities, and she walked away from the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto,
Yes.
which you're probably familiar with, and was very vocal
Yeah.
about it. And I completely applaud her for doing that, and for doing it in the way that she did it. In your
Yeah.
experience working on smart cities and IoT, and we both have experience in this space, uh,
Hmm.
you know, how do you feel about Anne's approach there? And what issues are you seeing in the work that you're doing in this space as well? Are they similar? Are they improving? Or are you seeing that there's still not enough, focus being given to
Yeah.
security and data protection in the IoT space?
Look, so on Anne's approach, 100% agree with you, and think that she made the only decision that she could make in that circumstance, as a highly, probably the most highly regarded privacy professional in the world, or certainly one of them. How can you be an advisor where your advisory role really is just to sort of, placate the various masses and, interest groups, but in fact, no one's really taking your advice and no one's really acknowledging that the issues that you are raising are central to community trust in the smart precinct that you're trying to develop, which in this case was Sidewalk Labs. I think Anne did exactly what she needed to do. And, you know, I think there was a resounding impact across the smart cities development space as a result, because privacy all of a sudden was on the map. It was like, really, you could have snapped your fingers and privacy was all of a sudden a thing. I remember I had been talking to various groups for many years, sort of in a piecemeal fashion, about privacy for smart cities. And when Anne spectacularly resigned, all of a sudden I was getting calls, as opposed to me calling and sort of insinuating myself in that environment, in that decision making environment. Instead, I was getting calls and saying, please, can you come and talk to us about privacy, in relation to our initiative? And so it certainly changed the narrative for privacy, in that smart city space. So I think she did the right thing. And I think she also shone a light on, honestly, a really important issue when it comes to public private partnerships. I don't necessarily think that Sidewalk Labs was a bad idea. I think, though, that when it comes to community perception of risk, you actually need to read the room before you enter into particular public private partnerships. And so when you want to do something as um, relevant and exciting and potentially life changing for a city when it comes to the use of data and sensing technologies, maybe you don't want to be partnering with Alphabet
Yeah, yeah.
in the
I mean,
first instance,
the one
right?
the one thing that Anne made very clear was she really highlighted the point of understanding the entire organism. So if you think about this in terms of
Mm,
biology, how different parts of an organism interact with different organs within that organism, and understanding how that interaction works. So, for example, if you're studying neuropsychology, you need to have a deep understanding of the endocrine system, how your hormones work, and how they infect you,
mm-hmm.
impact you as an individual. And Anne really did that because at the top level, it looked like there was privacy by design, there was compliance. But when you delved deeper and you looked at how these first tier suppliers or vendors or organs, if you would like, were interacting with other parties outside, so parties further down the line, third parties, fourth parties, nth parties, etc. That's where the problem occurred. It wasn't that the first layer didn't have privacy by design. It's all those other entities beneath that first layer who weren't directly involved in the project but were interacting with those organisms within that project, within that biology. That's where the problems arose. And understanding that full environment, all the stakeholders, what the potential for data sharing is, who those companies are answerable to if they're in a group of companies, for example, was really where the point arose, and was why she walked out. And I think it was really important for her to highlight that, because it's something that we generally don't see enough of, right?
No, that's exactly right. And on that topic of this sort of, um, it's a really interesting sort of risk model that you get with certain vendors, right? And you see, in a smart city context, you may have a prime vendor, but they also then have all their different vendors and suppliers, and the 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 risk tends to get managed down, but in a way so that it becomes diffuse and almost appears to disappear. But the reality is that it doesn't. In fact, it grows exponentially, because the further you go down the line, the less attentive to the risk to the individual concerned, whose personal information it is that's being gathered way back here up the line, the less attentive you are to that and to the potential harm for that individual. But also, you're not attentive to other things, compliance things, like an individual's right to access personal information about themselves, or to, in certain circumstances where information is used for, say, data analysis or what have you, and if it's wrong, the ability to correct that information is also really important. And what you find is that there isn't really the capacity in some of these vendor relationships for that to occur in any sort of sensible way. And so this is also a topic that we discuss here in our Smart Cities forums. And I have to say, there is something called the Smart Cities Council of Australia and New Zealand that, up until just a couple of weeks ago, was headed by my dear friend Adam Beck. And that council has been really active in the privacy space. So they've created something called the Center for Data Leadership, and the center is predicated on some key principles around data. Two of them are ones that are near and dear to us. One's privacy, and the other is security. And so there's always an opportunity when that council meets with its members, who are almost all local governments and vendors that are working on relationships with those local governments for whatever the smart city technology or agendas are. There's an opportunity for folks like me to get up and talk about privacy or information security or broader cyber security, and to get some traction. And it doesn't always generate a job, but what it does do is generate awareness.
Yeah.
And for me, particularly at this stage in my career, Alex, I feel that there's more of a need for that we have. We've been privileged to work in this industry for a really long time and to understand it well. And I think that there's this sort of obligation that comes with that, to share what we know so that others can benefit from it, even if we ourselves don't directly benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, you probably, like me, I've done thousands of hours of pro bono work over the past 15 years just to
Yes.
be able to, create awareness and to change culture, et cetera, et cetera. It's an integral part of what I do. And people often say, you don't charge enough, or why aren't you charging for that? Because you can't, part of your job in this space, if you're doing this for the reasons that we're doing it, because you're passionate about the impact on society and individuals, then you need to raise that awareness, because that supports your arguments, it supports your work, makes people understand why this stuff is important. One more quick question before we go, because we're
Sure.
nearly out of time. So IoT and smart cities and etc. is blurring the lines between virtual and physical. So on the one side, we've already talked about smart cities a little bit, not as much as I would like. We'll do another session on it at some point.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is the metaverse, which is again blurring the lines between reality and the virtual, but from the opposite perspective. In the EU, there's a lot of focus on the metaverse at the moment. I've given quite a few speeches and presentations already on the risks around the metaverse. What's the situation like in Australia where you are? How is the metaverse being received there, and how much are you speaking about it? What demand is there to understand how the metaverse can affect or impact privacy and data protection?
Right. So this is really interesting because I'm with you. It's a really important topic, and it's actually, another one of the reasons why folks like you and I never get bored with our profession, because almost as soon as we land in sort of a comfortable zone, something changes, and we have more we need to learn and more we need to be able to share insight on. So I do love that. What I'm noticing with the metaverse is that it's becoming quite a sexy topic in the smart cities context, and particularly around the upcoming Brisbane Olympics. So we're going to have Olympics here in 2032, and there's some talk about how the metaverse could be really integral to the deployment of those Olympics, because of course events like this are starting to look different, and particularly as we're going through a global pandemic and there are changes to people's travel patterns and their abilities to gather together, socially or for sporting events. There's a lot of talk about how do we make the Olympics accessible to everyone, and the metaverse, you know, has been is being looked at potentially as, as an option to explore. Similarly, we have local councils exploring opportunities for local, say, small business commercial initiatives with with that metaverse um, environment being at the core of that initiative, right? In order to allow for everyone to stay where they are, but participate in reality at the same time, participate in commerce and participate socially. So there's a lot of excitement around it, and I have to confess that I don't feel as excited, but I think it's because I'm always worried where there's you know an uptake of something that appears to be wonderful in terms of technology without anybody just talking about the potential risks and pitfalls to that, um, not as a showstopper and not as a drag on progress, as I was saying, but just as, let me give you another lens to look at the metaverse through, so that you understand the risks as well as the opportunities,
Mhm.
and then make a good decision based on what you know. Weigh up the risks against the opportunities and make a good decision. And I think this is the place where folks like you and me will be advising on more into the future. I think though that it's not going to be taking away from our day-to-day, the work in terms of legislative compliance and privacy program building for organizations, because that stuff's in the now. So everyone gets really excited about the future, but it's also it's hard to advise of, in a future state when we haven't caught up yet with all of that in terms of our regulation, and the ability to enforce that space.
I mean, as a geek, there's one side of me is a big fan of technology, absolutely, without question.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I do is based around technology. My work in privacy is born from my love of technology and how empowering it is and how it moves borders. I met my wife in what could only be described as an early version of the metaverse in a video game. She used to kick my ass regularly in a video game, and we've been together 10 years now. So I love the these virtual environments and what they do to break down borders and prejudice and allow people to live in a global village and all these other wonderful things to dissolve the digital divide, etc. But at the same time, the other side of me as a sociologist and a psychologist, before we even start to consider privacy and data protection and other issues, if you think back to Wall-E, you remember the wonderful movie Wall-E with the little
I love
robot.
that
Yeah,
movie.
and
Yes,
and when you see towards the end of the movie all the people sat in those reclined chairs floating, all overweight, obese,
with their
living
tiny
in
little
this,
feet
yeah,
and they can't walk.
yeah,
Yes.
living in this kind of metaverse environment. So before you even start to consider issues around privacy and these other things that we've been talking about, even just that, how that can impact us as a society, as individuals,
Mhm.
if we can access everything through a virtual interface, never have to go anywhere anymore, never have to go into the garden to pick flowers, or never have to go to the store to buy food, or go to the park to interact with other people. What does that mean for us as a society and as a civilization? There's so
Yeah.
much nuance and so much complexity and so many issues surrounding these emerging technologies, which I don't think we're mature enough yet as a society to be able to
Mhm.
manage appropriately, and that is, my main concern.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think on that topic, when as you move forward with the show, my dear friend Katina Michael, Dr. Katina Michael, she speaks on and lectures on public interest technologies and this whole space that we're talking about now. The idea that whatever it is we are building really needs to serve humanity, and that answering that question about whether what we're building is serving humanity it's a deep question.
Yeah, yeah.
She has so much insight. Oh, and her network of amazing colleagues as well. I would love to introduce you to them,
I would love that.
because
Yeah.
I think she would have so much insight on this topic in particular.
Well, let's get her on the show. I'd love to, and we can have more than one person on the show as well. We figure it out
Yeah,
somehow. But no,
absolutely. I'll
that
connect
would be
you.
fantastic. All right. Well, it's been lovely, Nicole. It really has. I could talk for hours, and I'm sure you could as well. But it's getting late there,
Yeah.
so I don't. And obviously, my wife is already demanding a pay rise for the extra time now. She's worth every penny, so there's no problem there. But it's getting towards the end of lunch now, so we need to cut this
No,
one.
it's okay. My little boy is demanding another good night kiss. He had to get up. He had to get up to get a Band-Aid for something. So I'm gonna go and give him a good night kiss and make sure that Band-Aid is on securely.
It's been a great pleasure. I'd love to have you back sometime, and I'd love to do some work with you on a project sometime. I think it'd be really fascinating.
That sounds wonderful. Count me in.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Nicole. Have a wonderful evening or what's left of it, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you to all our watchers and listeners. We didn't get much time for questions today because there was so much to talk about. I just didn't want to interrupt. But next time we'll ask more questions, so feel free to come back next week where we will have another show. And we'll start in from next Friday. We'll be doing Alternatives 2, which is a new series looking at alternative solutions to the big tech services out there. So mostly open source solutions or solutions which are very low cost and don't have all the data being sent to Silicon Valley. So thank you, everybody. I'll see you all next week. Thank you again, Nicole. It's been a great pleasure. Have a wonderful week,
Thank you.
everybody. Bye bye.
Good night. Bye.